Check your watch, sir. The boy's voice was soft enough that, for a moment, Coleman Ashford thought the words had come from somewhere inside the mechanism of the small brass carriage clock on the mantel, the one his wife had purchased in a shop on the left bank in the spring of 1988, and which had been keeping time in that particular room ever since. He was standing at the tall east-facing window of his private study on the 61st floor of the building that bore his name, holding a glass of single malt in his right hand, the ice still whole, and he had been watching the last color drain out of the sky above Central Park. He did not turn immediately. He was 71 years old, and he had learned over the course of a very long career that certain voices in certain rooms were best answered slowly. He turned. The boy was standing just inside the doorway of the study, one small hand resting against the polished walnut of the frame, his narrow shoulders held very still. He was perhaps 9 years old, 10 at the most, in a clean navy button-down that had been ironed by someone who cared about the crease of the collar but had not owned a professional press. His hair was cut close and neat, and there was a slight dampness at his temples that suggested he had washed his face and combed his hair before coming up here, in the way a child prepares himself when he has decided to do something that will be remembered. Coleman recognized him after a moment. The boy's mother, Simone Reed, had been the head of the private floor housekeeping staff for nearly 4 years, and she had brought her son with her on the 2 afternoons a week when the after-school program that had been keeping him occupied had lost its funding in the fall. Coleman had seen the child perhaps 6 times in the corridors and had nodded once. He had never spoken to him. "What did you say?" Coleman asked. The boy did not look away. There was no fear in his face exactly, but there was a great deal of care, the care of a child who had been taught all his short life to speak quietly in rooms that did not belong to him and who was now choosing, against every instinct that had been given to him, to be heard. "Check your watch, sir," he said again, more clearly this time. "The one you're wearing on your left wrist. It isn't yours." Coleman Ashford set the glass of scotch down on the marble side table beside the window. He did so slowly, with the deliberate calm of a man who had built the largest privately held asset management firm in North America on never being seen to move quickly. He had been threatened, subpoenaed, misquoted, and once in 2003 followed for 11 days by a private investigator hired by a business rival who had underestimated him. He had never, in any of those moments, set a glass down quickly. He did not do so now. "Son," he said, in the low, unhurried voice he reserved for conversations that would matter later, "come here a moment, walk slowly. What is your name?" "Malachi, sir, Malachi Reed." "Malachi." Coleman tested the name the way he tested the name of anyone who had just walked uninvited into the most private room of his home. "How did you come to be up here this evening?" The boy took 3 careful steps into the study and stopped, folding his hands in front of him. He smelled faintly of the plain soap the staff kept in the service washroom off the freight corridor, and there was a small dry patch on the knee of his trousers where he had knelt on something recently. "My mama sent me to bring up the pressed linens from the laundry room on 59, he said. "The service elevator was being cleaned, so I came up the stairs. I passed by your study because the door was open. I saw your watch on your wrist when you lifted your glass, sir. And it isn't the one you wore on Tuesday." Coleman Ashford did not move for a long moment. He looked down at his left wrist, at the watch strapped there against the cuff of his charcoal shirt. It was a slim rectangular piece in rose gold, with a cream dial and small Roman numerals arranged in the exact quiet arrangement he had come to know by heart over the course of 43 years. It was, or appeared to be, the Patek Philippe that his father had given him on the afternoon of his graduation from law school in the spring of 1976. He had worn it every working day of his life since. He had worn it when he had signed the papers that founded Ashford Capital in 1981. He had worn it at his own wedding, at the births of his 2 daughters, at his father's funeral in 1994, and at his wife's funeral 11 years ago. It had been serviced twice in its long life, once by the manufacturer in Geneva and once by a specialist in London, and it had never in 43 years left his person for longer than the duration of those 2 services. Coleman lifted his wrist slightly and turned it in the lamplight. The watch looked correct. The cream of the dial was the correct cream. The numerals were the correct numerals. The small aperture at 6 o'clock showed the date in the correct typeface. But he understood, with a clarity that arrived somewhere beneath his conscious attention, that a 9-year-old boy who had been in a room with him only once before did not walk uninvited into the private study of a man like Coleman Ashford to make a mistake about a watch. Children of Malachi's age and situation did not enter such rooms at all unless they had been given, or had given themselves, a reason so large that it overruled every quiet instruction they had ever received. "Malachi," Coleman said carefully, "come and stand here beside me. Show me what you see." The boy crossed the last few feet of the study and stopped beside the tall window. He lifted one small finger and pointed, not quite touching the crystal. "The second hand, sir. Watch it. It moves in little jumps. Yours doesn't. Yours sweeps smooth. I saw it on Tuesday when you were signing a paper in the front hall and I was standing by the door with the linens. I remember because my grandpa had a watch that swept smooth like that, and my mama told me it meant it was a very good watch and I should always notice things like that because most people don't." Coleman lowered his eyes to the dial. He watched the second hand for the span of 10 full seconds. The boy was right. The hand was moving in the small, discrete increments of a quartz movement, one tick per second, precise and mechanical and wrong. The Patek Philippe on his wrist should have swept, the smooth, continuous glide of a mechanical movement running at 28,800 vibrations per hour. He had watched that sweep across his own wrist for 4 decades. He knew it in the way a man knew the rhythm of his own breathing. He felt for the first time in a great many years the small, cold weight of something he could not immediately name settle in the middle of his chest. He did not let it show in his face. He had learned long ago that a face which showed what a man was thinking was a face that had already lost the room. "When did you see me on Tuesday, Malachi?" he asked. "About 4 in the afternoon, sir. You were coming out of the elevator with 2 men in suits, and you stopped at the console table by the front door to sign something on a clipboard the taller man was holding. I was standing by the coat closet with the linens because Mama had asked me to wait until the front hall was clear before I crossed it. You didn't see me, but I saw the watch, sir, and it wasn't this one." Coleman Ashford stood very still beside the tall window. The city below the 61st floor had begun to light itself in the slow, uneven way that cities do at the last edge of evening, and he watched the small lamps come on in the apartment towers across the park without really seeing them. He was thinking about Tuesday. He was thinking about the 2 men in suits who had come up in the elevator with him, and about the clipboard, and about the paper he had signed in the front hall without looking at it closely because the taller of the 2 men had been speaking to him about a matter that required the greater part of his attention. The taller man was a person named Whitfield Crane, who had been the senior managing director of Ashford Capital's private client division for the past 19 years, and whom Coleman had known since 1996. The shorter man had been introduced to him 3 months earlier as a specialist in bespoke security consulting, a man named Ridley Vance who had, according to Whitfield, been vetted through channels that Coleman himself had approved. Coleman had spent perhaps 11 hours in Ridley Vance's company over the course of those 3 months, and had come to consider him a competent and unobtrusive addition to the small circle of men who had been given access to the private floors of the building. Coleman turned his wrist over slowly. He looked at the underside of the watch, at the small engraving that had been placed there by his father in the spring of 1976, 4 words in a hand Coleman had known his entire life. He tilted the watch toward the lamplight. The engraving was there. The letters were correct. The spacing was correct. But when he looked closely, closer than he had looked at the back of the watch in perhaps 15 years, he saw that the depth of the cut was wrong. His father's engraving had been done by an old jeweler on 47th Street who had used a hand graver and who had cut deep, the letters carved with the small irregularities of a human hand pressed against metal. The letters on the watch on his wrist had been cut cleanly and shallowly by a machine. He understood. in the small, quiet way that a man understands a fact he has already been shown but has not yet accepted, that the watch on his wrist was a replica. It was an extraordinarily good replica. It had been made by someone who had studied the original watch closely enough to reproduce not only the dial and the case and the numerals, but the specific pattern of small wear marks that 43 years of continuous use had left on the crown and the bezel. It had been made, he understood further, by someone who had held his watch in his hands for long enough to measure it. Coleman lowered his wrist. He looked at the boy beside him. "Malachi," he said quietly, "I need you to think very carefully. When you saw me in the front hall on Tuesday, was there anyone else in the corridor? Anyone at all, whether they were speaking to me or not?" The boy considered the question. He did not rush his answer. Coleman understood that this was a child who had been taught somewhere in his short life that a question worth asking was a question worth answering slowly. "There was a woman at the far end of the corridor, sir. She was standing near the door to the service pantry, and she was holding a small bag. She wasn't dressed like staff. She was in a gray suit, and she had a briefcase with her, the kind that opens flat. She was speaking to the shorter of the two men in suits, the one who wasn't Mr. Crane. She was speaking very quietly. When Mr. Crane finished with the clipboard, she and the shorter man went into the service pantry together, and Mr. Crane followed you into the elevator." Coleman did not answer immediately. He walked slowly to the small writing desk on the far side of the study and stood behind it, his fingertips resting on the leather blotter. He was arranging in his mind the sequence of a Tuesday afternoon he had, until this moment, believed to be entirely ordinary. He remembered the Tuesday clearly now that he had a reason to remember it. He had come up in the elevator with Whitfield Crane and Ridley Vance shortly before 4 in the afternoon. Whitfield had been carrying a leather portfolio, and Ridley had been carrying a small aluminum case that Coleman had assumed contained the surveillance schematics they were meant to review together that evening. In the front hall, Whitfield had produced a clipboard from the portfolio and asked Coleman to initial a routine authorization form, a document related to the quarterly renewal of the private floor access protocols. Coleman had initialed it without reading it in detail, because Whitfield Crane had handled such documents for 19 years, and because Coleman's attention had been on the conversation about the security consultant's recommendations for the summer. He remembered now that Whitfield had asked him to remove his watch. He remembered because it had been an odd request, and because at the time he had not thought it odd at all. "The magnetic field from the new access panel in the front hall is stronger than the old one," Whitfield had said, in the light and slightly apologetic tone he used for small technical inconveniences. "It can throw off a mechanical movement. Ridley's team is going to install a shielded housing next month, but until then I'd recommend removing your watch when you come through the door, just for a moment. I'll hold it for you." Coleman had unclasped the Patek Philippe and handed it to Whitfield. Whitfield had set it carefully on the console table beside the clipboard. Coleman had signed the initials on the form. Whitfield had picked up the watch and handed it back. Coleman had refastened the clasp on his wrist without looking at the watch closely, because Whitfield Crane had been his colleague for 19 years, and because a man did not stand in his own front hall inspecting a watch that had just been handed back to him by a man he trusted. The exchange had taken perhaps 12 seconds. It had been long enough. Coleman looked at the boy across the length of the study. Malachi was standing very still beside the window, his hands folded in front of him, his small face composed with the particular kind of stillness that certain children learn when they have understood that a grown man in a difficult moment does not want to be watched too closely. "Malachi," Coleman said, "I want you to do something for me. I want you to walk to the small telephone on the shelf beside the door, the one with the black handset, and I want you to press the button marked with the number 2. When the line is answered, I want you to hand me the receiver without speaking. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." The boy crossed the room. Coleman heard the small click of the receiver being lifted, the soft chime of the internal line, the quiet padding of the boy's feet as he walked back. Coleman took the receiver without turning from the desk. Simone, he said. The voice on the other end belonged to Malachi's mother, the head of the private floor housekeeping staff. Coleman had known her for 4 years. She was a woman of perhaps 38, quiet and precise, who had come to the position from a smaller residence downtown, and who kept the floors of Coleman's home with the unfussy competence of a person who had been raised to do work well because the work itself deserved to be done well. Mr. Ashford. Simone, your son is here with me in the study. He is perfectly safe, and he has just told me something that I need to look into carefully. I would like you to do 3 things in this order without asking questions. First, please walk to the front hall and stand by the console table. Do not touch anything. Do not let anyone else touch anything. If Mr. Crane or Mr. Vance approaches the console table for any reason, please tell them that I have asked to see them in the study, and I will be down in 15 minutes. There was a small pause on the line. Yes, Mr. Ashford. Second, please walk to my dressing room on this floor and open the top drawer of the mahogany bureau. Inside the drawer, beneath the folded handkerchiefs, you will find a small brown leather box. Bring that box to the door of the study and slide it underneath. Do not knock. Do not enter. Third, please ask the doorman on the ground floor to call up to me directly if either Mr. Crane or Mr. Vance attempts to leave the building this evening. Tell the doorman that the request comes from me personally and that it is not to be spoken of. Yes, Mr. Ashford. Thank you, Simone. He set the receiver down. He turned back to the boy. Malachi was standing near the desk now, his hands still folded. His eyes lowered the small, respectful fraction that he had been taught somewhere in his short life to lower them in rooms where adults were arranging things that mattered. Coleman looked at him for a long moment. Malachi, he said, your mother is going to bring me something in a few minutes, and then I am going to ask you and your mother to wait together in the small sitting room beside the kitchen while I speak with 2 men who work for me. I want you to know that you have done something very important tonight, and I want you to know that no one is going to be angry with you or with your mother for what you have told me. Do you understand? Yes, sir. There is one more thing I would like to ask you before your mother arrives. Can you tell me what the woman in the gray suit looked like? Take your time. Whatever you can remember will be helpful. The boy considered the question. He did not answer immediately. He was, Coleman realized, doing something that most adults had forgotten how to do. He was closing his eyes and returning to the corridor on Tuesday afternoon and looking at the woman there patiently in the small, unhurried way that a child looks at a picture in a book he wants to remember. She was tall, sir. Not as tall as Mr. Crane, but tall for a woman. Her hair was brown, and it was pinned up at the back of her head with a silver clip. She had a scar on the back of her right hand, a small thin line between her thumb and her first finger, and she was wearing a wedding ring, but only one ring, no other jewelry. Her briefcase was dark brown and it had 2 brass clasps at the top, and the corner of the briefcase near her hand had a small dent in it, like she had set it down hard on something. She spoke with her hands close to her body, and she didn't look at me when I walked past. But I looked at her, sir, because she wasn't dressed like anyone I had seen on the floor before, and my mama has told me to always notice when a person is somewhere they don't usually go. Coleman was quiet for a long moment. He was thinking about the description. He was thinking about a woman named Priscilla Lang, who was the senior appraiser at a certain small and very discreet auction house in Midtown that specialized in the private sale of luxury timepieces to collectors who preferred that their acquisitions not appear in any public record. He had met Priscilla Lang twice, at events he had attended out of professional courtesy, and he remembered a scar on the back of her right hand from the first of those meetings, where she had extended her hand to shake his in a room lit by chandeliers. He remembered the scar because he had noticed it and had chosen not to ask about it, because certain scars belonged to their owners and were not the business of a stranger. He remembered also that Priscilla Lang was not, so far as he had ever known, an employee or contractor or associate of Ashford Capital. Malachi, he said quietly, you have a very good eye. From the doorway came the soft sound of something sliding across the polished floor. Coleman turned. A small brown leather box, no larger than a paperback, lay just inside the threshold of the study. Simone Reed had done exactly what he had asked, and she had done it in the quiet way she did everything, without making her footsteps heard. "Malachi, would you bring that to me, please?" The boy crossed the room and picked up the box with both hands, the way a child carries something that has been described to him as important. He set it on the desk beside Coleman and stepped back. Coleman opened the box. Inside, resting on a small square of dark green felt, was a watch. It was slim, rectangular in rose gold, with a cream dial and small Roman numerals arranged in the exact quiet arrangement he had come to know by heart. It was the Patek Philippe that his father had given him on the afternoon of his graduation from law school in the spring of 1976. He had placed it in this box on the 14th of January of the current year, when he had sent the watch he was now wearing on his wrist to what he had believed to be a routine service. The service had been arranged by Whitfield Crane, who had told him that the specialist in London was no longer accepting private clients, and had recommended a discreet firm in Geneva that had returned the watch, or what had appeared to be the watch, 4 weeks later. Coleman had worn the returned watch continuously since the middle of February. He had worn it for 4 months and 11 days, but the watch in the small brown leather box was the true one. The engraving on its back had the small, irregular depth of a hand graver pressed against gold by a man in a shop on 47th Street in 1976. The second hand, when Coleman lifted the watch carefully from the felt and held it to the lamplight, swept in the smooth, continuous glide of a movement running at 28,800 vibrations per hour. For a long moment Coleman did not understand. He had not placed the true watch in this box. He had placed the returned watch, the watch he had believed to be his own, in a small velvet-lined drawer in his dressing room after wearing it for the first time in mid-February. The box on the desk before him contained a watch that should not have been there. Then he understood. He understood in the way a man understands a fact that has been arranged around him for months without his knowledge. He understood that someone in his own household had, at some point in the past 4 months, quietly removed the returned watch from the velvet-lined drawer where he had placed it and had substituted the original in its place, and had then equally quietly placed the returned watch on his wrist during the 12-second exchange in the front hall on Tuesday afternoon. Someone in his household had been protecting him. He looked at the watch on his wrist. He looked at the watch in his hand. He set the true watch down carefully on the leather blotter and unfastened the replica from his wrist and placed it beside the true one. In the lamplight, side by side, the two watches were almost identical. Almost. He could see now that the replica was very slightly heavier, and that the crown was set at an angle that was perhaps a quarter of a degree different from the original. It was the kind of difference a man would never notice on his own wrist. It was the kind of difference that a person who had held the original watch in her hands for the better part of an evening might have measured with an instrument and might have failed by that quarter degree to reproduce. Coleman was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up the internal telephone on the desk and pressed the button marked with the number 1. "Simone," he said, "please come to the study. Bring your keys. And please close the door of the front hall behind you." Simone Reed arrived within 90 seconds. She came into the study quietly as she came into every room, and she closed the door behind her with the small, careful click of a woman who had spent her working life making doors close without being heard. She was in her uniform still, a plain black dress with a white collar, and she carried a small ring of keys in her left hand. She did not look at her son at first. She looked at Coleman. Coleman understood from the small composure of her face that she had already understood a great deal of what had happened in the study without needing to be told. "Mr. Ashford, Simone, please sit down." She did not sit. She stood beside the desk with her hands folded and her keys held quietly between her fingers. "Simone," Coleman said, "I would like to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it directly. On what date did you first move the watch in my dressing room from the velvet-lined drawer to the small leather box in the bureau, and why did you do it?" Simone Reed was quiet for a moment. She looked at the two watches lying side by side on the leather blotter. She looked at her son, who was standing very still beside the window. She looked back at Coleman. "The 22nd of February, Mr. Ashford. And why did you do it, Simone?" "Because on the 21st of February I was polishing the mirror in your dressing room, and Mr. Crane came in through the door from the corridor. He did not see me. The mirror is set back in an alcove, and the angle is such that a person entering the room does not see anyone who is standing in front of it." Mr. Crane went to the velvet-lined drawer and opened it and looked at the watch inside for a long time. He did not touch it. He took a photograph of it with a small camera, not his telephone, a proper camera, and he wrote something in a small notebook. Then he closed the drawer and left. Coleman did not speak. "I stood in the alcove for perhaps 3 minutes after he left, Mr. Ashford. Then I went to the drawer and looked at the watch myself. I have cleaned that dressing room for 4 years. I have opened that drawer perhaps 200 times to dust it. I know what the watch looks like. The watch in the drawer that afternoon was not the same watch that had been in the drawer the previous week. The engraving on the back was different. I did not know what it meant. But I knew that Mr. Crane had come into a room he had no reason to be in, and had taken a photograph of a watch that was not the one you had been wearing before you sent it to Geneva. And I knew that Mr. Crane was not a man who did things without a reason. Where is the watch that Mr. Crane photographed, Simone?" "In the small brown leather box in the bureau, Mr. Ashford, underneath the handkerchiefs. I moved it there the following morning. I put the true watch, the one that had been in the drawer for the past 4 years, in its place in the velvet-lined drawer. I did not know when Mr. Crane would come back for the watch he had photographed, or how he intended to take it. I knew only that if he came back for it and it was not there, he would understand that someone in the household had seen him, and that someone would be in more danger than the watch. So you left the false watch in the drawer for him to find?" "Yes, sir." "And you did not tell me?" Simone Reed looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were folded still. Her keys had not moved between her fingers. "Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "I have worked in houses like this one for 22 years. I have learned in that time that a woman in my position who tells a man like you that a man like Mr. Crane has been doing something wrong is very rarely believed, and is very often dismissed within the week." Coleman Ashford was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the two watches on the leather blotter. He looked at the boy standing beside the window, and at the boy's mother standing beside the desk, and he thought about the 4 months and 11 days he had walked through his own home wearing a replica watch on his wrist, and about the woman who had known the truth of it for 4 months and 11 days, and had kept the true watch safe in a drawer, because she had understood correctly that a direct warning from her would have cost her the position that fed her son. "Simone," he said at last, "I owe you an apology." She did not answer. "I owe you an apology because you are right. If you had come to me on the 22nd of February and told me what you had seen, I would have listened politely, and I would have spoken to Whitfield about it in a way that would have alerted him to the fact that you had spoken, and you would very likely have been dismissed within the fortnight for some quiet and unrelated reason. You understood that. You understood it because you have lived a life in which you have had to understand it, and I have lived a life in which I have not had to understand it. Thank you for keeping the watch safe. Thank you for keeping your son safe. Thank you for coming into this room tonight and telling me the truth when I finally asked for it." Simone Reed inclined her head very slightly. She did not speak, because she was a woman who understood that certain apologies were best received in silence. Coleman turned to the desk. He picked up the internal telephone and pressed the button marked with the number 3. It was the line that rang directly in the small apartment on the 58th floor that had been occupied for the past 29 years by a woman named Vera Kaminsky, who had been Coleman's personal counsel since 1997, and who had, at his insistence, taken up residence in the building 6 years earlier when the first of the small health difficulties of her late 60s had made it impractical for her to commute from Brooklyn. Vera Kaminsky did not work for Ashford Capital. She worked only for Coleman. She had been chosen for the position because she had no other client and no other loyalty, and she had held the position for 29 years because in all of that time she had never once given Coleman a reason to doubt that arrangement. She answered on the first ring. "Coleman." "Vera, I need you in my study. Now, do not use the front hall. Come up through the private stair from the 59th floor and enter through the door beside the library. Bring the recorder, bring the notarial seal, bring the blank affidavits." There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. 15 minutes, Coleman. Thank you. He set the receiver down. He looked at Simone Reed. "Simone, I would like you and Malachi to remain in this room until Vera arrives. When she is here, I would like her to take a statement from Malachi in his own words, and I would like her to take a statement from you. After that, I am going to ask the two of you to wait in the small sitting room beside the kitchen while I speak with Mr. Crane and Mr. Vance. I am not going to speak with them tonight in a way that requires either of you to be present. I am going to speak with them in a way that gives Vera the paper she will need tomorrow morning. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Ashford. There is one more thing. Whatever happens in the coming weeks, you and Malachi will not lose your position in this household. You will not lose your home. You will not lose the after-school program that closed in the fall. I will make sure of all three of those things by the end of business tomorrow. I am telling you this now because I would like you to be able to answer Vera's questions without carrying the weight of wondering." Simone Reed's hands moved for the first time since she had entered the room. She lifted them from the front of her dress and folded them again in a slightly different way, and Coleman understood, from that small movement, that she had been carrying the weight of that wondering for 4 months and 11 days. He turned away from her, because he understood also that she was a private woman and would prefer that he did not watch her carry the weight setting itself down. Vera Kaminsky arrived in 12 minutes. She came up the private stair without being heard, and she entered the study through the door beside the library, and she was carrying a small leather satchel that Coleman had seen perhaps 6 times in 29 years. She was 74 years old. She wore a plain dark suit and low black shoes, and her white hair was pinned at the back of her head with a small tortoiseshell clip. She looked at Coleman. She looked at the 2 watches on the leather blotter. She looked at Simone Reed and at the boy beside the window. She did not ask a question. She set the satchel on the desk and opened it. "Coleman," she said, "tell me." He told her. He told her in 14 minutes. He left nothing out. He told her about the 12 seconds in the front hall on Tuesday, and about the service in January, and about the watch on his wrist and the watch in the box. And he told her what Simone Reed had told him, and what Malachi Reed had told him. And when he was finished, Vera Kaminsky was quiet for a long moment, and then she reached into the satchel and took out the recorder and the notarial seal and the leather folder of blank affidavits. And she set them on the desk in the unhurried order that Coleman had watched her set such things down on desks for 29 years. She turned to Malachi. "Young man," she said, "my name is Ms. Kaminsky. I am Mr. Ashford's lawyer. I am going to ask you some questions, and I am going to write your answers down. When we are finished, I will read them back to you, and if I have written them correctly, I will ask you to sign your name at the bottom. Have you ever signed a legal document before?" "No, ma'am." "Then this will be the first. Do you understand what it means to tell the truth under oath?" "Yes, ma'am. It means you tell the truth even when nobody would know if you didn't." Vera Kaminsky looked at the boy for one long moment. Then she looked at Coleman. Something passed between them that did not need to be spoken. "That is exactly what it means," she said quietly. "Sit down, Malachi. Take your time." What happened in the weeks that followed moved with the patient and deliberate weight that only serious money and older lawyers can bring to a matter that has been arranged in silence for months. Whitfield Crane was not confronted in the study that night. Coleman spoke with him in the study that night about an entirely different matter, a routine question concerning the summer allocation of the private client division, and Whitfield left the building at 10 minutes past 10, with no understanding that anything in his careful arrangement had come apart. Ridley Vance left the building shortly after him. Vera Kaminsky spent the remainder of that night at the desk in the study, writing the first 11 pages of what would eventually become a 43-page memorandum. And by 6 in the morning, she had made 3 telephone calls to 3 men in 3 different cities whose names Coleman had not heard spoken aloud in many years, but whose loyalty to Vera personally had been established in cases that predated Coleman's acquaintance with her. By the end of the first week, every transaction that Whitfield Crane had touched in 19 years had been quietly reviewed by a forensic accounting team working out of a small office in New Jersey. By the end of the second week, the true watch had been examined by a specialist who confirmed in a sealed report that the movement, the case, the dial, and the engraving were all original. By the end of the third week, the replica watch had been traced through the small auction house in Midtown to a private workshop in Zurich, and the workshop had been traced to a chain of 5 other commissions Whitfield Crane had placed over the course of 7 years. Each of them, a replica of an object belonging to a private client of Ashford Capital, each of the originals having been quietly removed from the client's possession and sold through the same auction house, and each of the clients being either elderly or recently widowed or both. The total value of the objects removed came to just under $61 million. The pattern had run for 7 years without any of the clients noticing, because Whitfield Crane had chosen his objects and his clients with the patient care of a man who understood that the wealthy do not, as a rule, look closely at things they have owned for a long time. Coleman Ashford was the 6th client. He had been chosen, Vera Kaminsky explained to him one evening in the study, because he was the largest of the 6, and because Whitfield had judged, correctly, that a man who had built a firm the size of Ashford Capital would be the least likely to notice the small, exact difference between a watch he had worn for 4 decades and a watch that had been made to look like it. Whitfield had not counted on the boy. Whitfield Crane pleaded guilty in the autumn to 9 of the 17 charges brought against him. Ridley Vance pleaded guilty to 4. Priscilla Lang cooperated in the way that a person cooperates when a satchel-carrying attorney of a certain age has arrived unannounced at her office with 3 men in dark coats and a court order that has been signed by a judge she had not expected. The auction house closed within the month. The 5 other objects, or their equivalents in cash, were returned to the 5 other clients, 4 of whom were still living, and 1 of whom had died the previous spring, without ever knowing that the small enamel box on her nightstand had not been the one her grandmother had left her. The recovered funds, when they came, filled a sum that Coleman did not return to his personal accounts. He placed the sum instead into a foundation that he established in the spring of the following year. The foundation's mission was written in a single sentence at the top of its charter: to fund the education of the children of household staff, and to fund the after-school programs that keep such children in safe rooms in the afternoons when their parents are at work. The first scholarship was awarded to a boy named Malachi Reed. Simone Reed did not leave her position. She accepted, after some negotiation, a small increase in her salary and a written contract that Vera Kaminsky drew up personally, the terms of which included a clause guaranteeing her employment for as long as she wished to remain in it. Malachi was enrolled in a private school 11 blocks from the building, and the after-school program that had lost its funding in the fall was quietly restored, with an endowment sufficient to keep it running for the next 40 years. Coleman Ashford lived for 9 more years after the evening the watch came off his wrist. He wore the true Patek Philippe every working day of those 9 years. He hosted Malachi Reed for tea in the study every Sunday afternoon that the boy was in the city, and they spoke of many things, and sometimes of watches. There are stories we tell about the great houses of the world, and about the men who live in them. We say that such men know what they own. We say that wealth pays attention to itself. It is not true. The truths of the great houses are almost always kept by the people who fold the linens and polish the mirrors and walk through the corridors on quiet afternoons. Pay attention to the ones who move through your rooms unseen. Learn the names of their children. The next time a small voice in your doorway tells you that something you are wearing is not what it appears to be, set down your glass. Listen. If this story moved you, please tap the like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the smallest voices are often the ones telling the largest truths. Subscribe so the next story finds you. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and remember always to listen to the quiet ones. You never know which of them may be about to change your life.